Keto and Krime, Keto and Krime. We uncover the grime on Keto and Krime. Keto and Krime, Keto and Krime. Now is the time for Keto and Krime.
Hey everyone, welcome to Keto and Krime. Today I've got number 1 in our series on serial killers. Speaking of serial killer type pain, I have managed to burn my tongue this morning because I didn't check my coffee. So, public service announcement, check your coffee before you drink it. And now, what's really bad is I won't be able to taste my Keto Crisp bar for at least a week. But I can contest they are quite delicious. They are all natural, great stuff, keto, vegan, and calorie counting friendly. So if you're looking to lose some weight or just want a tasty, healthy treat, check out Keto Crisp. Links are down below. Thanks so much. Ah, Tracy, why are you talking about food before we talk about a serial killer that also consumed his victims? Because Tracy tends to eat before a lot of things that would be considered inappropriate. Sorry. I like to eat. And you know what? This could be a longer one, so I suggest having a snack or a drink or wine or whatever you might need to get you through this. But yes, upfront warning about cannibalism. And just really creepy, crawly murder stuff. So, without being said, let's jump in. Dahmer would be considered one of, I think, the big 3 of serial killers here in the U.S. With him, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy. I think those are 3 that have just captured the imagination with documentaries, movies, horror villains being based on them. So, without a doubt, he's one of the big ones. But he was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, May 21st, 1960. He was the oldest son of Joyce Annette Flint. She was a teletype machine instructor, and Lionel Dahmer. He was a chemistry student at Marquette University and later a research scientist. They were of German and Welsh descent, as well as some Norwegian and Irish ancestry. So pasty white. Some sources report Dahmer was deprived of attention as an infant, and that may have been a cause of his psychosis, but then other accounts say that he was quite spoiled, so who knows, which kind of leads into that whole argument about nature versus nurture. Which is it? Are you born psychotic? A psychotic, cannibalistic serial killer? Or is it a learned behavior? I'm going to venture it's a little bit of both. I've always said that, but, you know, this is an interesting case study in that. Pretty uneventful childhood. Lionel was working on his advanced degree, so he was away from home much of the time that Jeffrey was enrolled in elementary school. Now, Joyce herself was a hypochondriac and also had acute depression. So she demanded constant attention and from her husband when he was home, and also from the children, and also spent a whole lot of time in bed. She attempted suicide several times, and as a result, rather than being neglected as an infant, Jeffrey was neglected as a young elementary school child. Many times he spoke at school as well as his brothers that things were just not really good at home. So yes, a troubled home life, I'm sure, has fed into his whole psychosis. But all in all, Jeffrey was pretty energetic, though timid, and didn't have a whole lot of friends, which would be something that would plague him later in life. October 1966, they moved from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Doylestown, Ohio, where his younger brother, David, was born. And since Lionel had finished his degree, he now started working as a chemist in Akron, Ohio, which was nearby. This was right about the time that young Jeffrey started manifesting a interest in dead animals. He would innately watch his father when he was removing dead animal bones from underneath the family home. He would play with the bones. He called them fiddlesticks. And he occasionally would crawl up under the house looking for additional bones, and also would look at any type of dead carcass that he found to examine it and get more bones. 2 years later, 68, they moved to Bath Township, Ohio. Now, they moved around a lot. This was maybe their third address in 2 years, sixth address since the mom and dad got married. So Jeffrey was used to moving around quite a bit. But this was on an acre of wooded area, and about a half-mile's walk into the woods, there was what Jeffrey would call the hut. It was just a little standalone shed in which he started collecting things, mainly insects, really strange insects like dragonflies, moths. He would also find skeletons of small animals and save them as well. He would start tinkering with formaldehyde and preserve them in that. And eventually he asked his father for help. So, during a chicken dinner, all-American chicken dinner, Jeffrey asked his father, Lionel, what would happen if you put chicken bones in bleach. And Lionel, being a chemist, was excited because this, to him, his son was now showing a interest in science and chemistry. So he showed him what would happen if you put chicken bones in bleach and how to preserve bones in bleach. And from that, Jeffrey kind of advanced his ability to preserve things. He started looking for dead bodies that were not decomposed, and he would do things like he decapitated a dead dog once, according to a friend. So he became very interested in how bodies fit together. Now, I was very morbidly curious as a child. Not this morbidly curious, but I was. One of my first dreams was to be a mortician, believe it or not. So death interested me. I think that's one reason for my interest in true crime and horror, is that death has always fascinated me and the way people die. I was watching those Faces of Death videos from the time I was like 12. It didn't really scare me. So I think that this type of interest does not necessarily show a morbid mind. And it's not necessarily going to make you into a serial killer, because if that was the case, I would have been one. I think where we get into the behavior that can cause you to be a killer is when the interest passes from interest in already dead things to live things. Stay tuned. Oh, that decapitated dog, he hung it up in this creepy Blair Witch Project kind of display and invited a friend over to look at it. So, during this time, unfortunately, Joyce started to go from depressive and being a hypochondriac to abuse of pills, and she would abuse sleeping pills, laxatives, really anything she could get her hands on, and so she began to slip further and further away from her family during this time. Jeffrey started his freshman year in high school at the age of 14 at Revere High School, and was basically kind of one of the outcasts. Didn't fit into any of the cliques. By age 14, he had begun drinking beer and alcohol in daylight hours, just in front of whoever, but he began concealing the liquor inside the lining of an army fatigue jacket that he wore every day. Upon being caught with a bottle of scotch in a morning history class, he told the instructor, "This is my medicine," and somehow got away with it. He was seen as very uncommunicative with his peers. He didn't really get along with them, though teachers liked him. Generally, yeah, a little weird. That Dahmer kid's a little weird, but he's exceptionally bright. But he doesn't work real hard. Like, he was very intelligent, could answer their questions, just the way a teacher would want you to answer their questions, but just did not have any interest in studies or homework or test taking, so he had mediocre grades, like B's and C's. And but he was a good athlete. He played tennis, was very good at it, and even played in the high school band for a brief season. It was about the time that he started drinking that he realized he was sexually attracted to boys, men, gay. He did not want to tell his parents nor tell anyone else. He did have a brief physical relationship with a teenage boy. They did everything but. And so it was during that period, because the boy didn't want to, the other boy did not want to take, home run, third base home run, did not want to go that far, that this is when Jeffrey began fantasizing about dominating sexual partners, because he was being told his limitations by this boy, and that really made him mad. So he wanted to be able to dominate and take things as far as he wanted to take it without regard for his partner. So you kind of see selfishness and a ability to not care about the feelings of others starting to come out here. By the time he was 16, these fantasies had escalated from consensual activity with, a dom and a sub to kind of creepy. He began being fascinated with the torso region of men, and his fantasies became entwined with dissection. He wanted to see how the pretty parts go together, kind of thing. And he even had a fantasy about a young jogger, he was about 21, that he would see jogging every morning on his way to school, and had a fantasy about knocking him unconscious and having his way with him and then dissecting him. In fact, his first attempted attack would be one morning on the way to school. He hid in the bushes with a baseball bat awaiting this jogger, but the jogger never came back. So that was his first attempted attack. It's about his junior year that he actually became known as a class clown. He would stage pranks both in school and in other places out in public, mostly consisting of pretending to be disabled. He would bleat, he would pretend to have seizures, act like he had cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and the local kids began calling any kind of weird, out-of-sorts pranks like that as pulling a Dahmer. Pulling a Dahmer. That has a whole other meaning now. His grades continued to slide. His parents got him a private tutor. And in the meantime, his parents, whose marriage was on the rocks, they began going to marriage counseling because Joyce's depression was just getting worse and worse, and she even began having an affair. Upon discovering it, Lionel wanted to work it out, but she didn't, so they decided they would just split amicably, and in September of 1977, they filed for divorce, and Lionel moved to a local hotel. He graduated from high school in May of 1978, but his drinking was actually escalating. A teacher caught him drinking an entire six-pack in a car on the school grounds and was going to report him, and he basically just looked her in the face without ever breaking an expression and said that he was having a lot of problems at home. This was his medicine, and the guidance counselor knew about it. I guess things were kind of loosey-goosey in the 70s. And at this time, just after graduation, his parents' divorce were finalized. His mother and younger brother, with whom she got custody of, moved to Wisconsin. Dahmer, who is now 18, remained in the family home in Ohio, and his mother received alimony payments from his father. Just 3 weeks after remaining home alone in his home, he committed his first murder, a young 19-year-old by the name of Stephen Hicks. Dahmer had gone to a concert and noticed Hicks standing shirtless on the road as he was starting to hitchhike back from the concert, and became aroused. He invited him back to his house for some drinks and music, and of course the young man said sure, but immediately began talking about girls, so Dahmer knew he wasn't going to be into any consensual rendezvous. After a few hours of drinking and listening to music, Hicks got up to leave. Dahmer became enraged and struck him on the back of the head with a 10-pound dumbbell. When Stephen hit the floor, Dahmer actually got on top of him and choked him to death with the bar of the dumbbell. After he died, Dahmer stripped him naked, had intercourse with the body, and then proceeded to dissect him. He buried some of the remains out back and would dig it up every so often to see how the flesh was decaying. He then began stripping the flesh from the bones, putting it in acid, and then he took the bones, bludgeoned them with a sledgehammer, and then kind of sprinkled them about. So he got rid of all the evidence of this particular murder. Meanwhile, Lionel has become engaged to another woman, and they are returning to the family home. And to be quite honest, Lionel was shocked to see his son living alone at the home. He thought he had gone to Wisconsin with his mother, which leads me to believe just how disconnected this family was. But he found that his son was living there, not working, basically drinking himself into a stupor, so he insisted that he enroll in college. And so Dahmer was enrolled at Ohio State University. He was planning to major in business, but with his alcoholism and his disinterest in academics altogether, he ended up failing every single course in his first semester except riflery, in which he received a B-. Lionel would go to visit his son quite often at the dorms, trying to encourage him, but he would see that his son's dorm room was littered with alcohol and that his son had a problem. And eventually he did allow his son to drop out, even though he had already prepaid for an entire year of college. After allowing his son to drop out of college, he wanted him to get some sort of training, have some sort of future, so Lionel encouraged his father to enlist in the Army, which Jeffrey did. He finished basic training and trained as a medic at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, and was deployed to Germany in July of 1979, where he served as a combat medic in the 8th Infantry Division. By virtue of his Army records, we know that he was an average or slightly above average soldier for the majority of his service. However, his vices still plagued him. His interest in grotesque and sex intertwined, especially with his alcoholism, which he was using to mask a lot of the issues he was having, became a real problem. His performance began to deteriorate, and in 1981, after 2 years of a 4-year enlistment, he was deemed unsuitable for military service and sent back to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for debriefing for a medical honorable discharge. He was offered a plane ticket to go anywhere in the country upon discharge, but he did not want to go back to Ohio to have to face his father's wrath. Instead, he asked for a ticket to Miami, Florida. Where he went, he got work at a deli and lived at a extended stay motel. However, he spent most of his salary on alcohol and ended up being evicted from the motel. He spent his days after that working at the delicatessen, sleeping on the beach at night, until he could absolutely not do it anymore, and he actually phoned his father and asked his father to help him get back to Ohio. His father did bring him back into his home, but he insisted that his son do chores around the house and look for a job, and he attempted to get him off alcohol. He was continuing to drink and eventually got arrested by local PD for drunken disorderly conduct, in which he had to pay a $60 fine and was given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. Jeffrey's father finally conceded that maybe he wasn't the best influence on his son, as he was, dealing with working, having to pay alimony and a new wife and all that. So he sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Now, the grandmother was the only part of the family that Jeffrey had ever showed any affection for, and they were hoping that her influence might be good for him. And for a while, it was. They lived pretty harmoniously. She got him into church, although he did continue to smoke and drink, though not as heavily. And in 1982, managed to find a job as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. And he held this job for almost a year. However, he got himself into trouble in August of 1982 when he was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair Park that included children there and everything, and he was convicted and fined $50 plus court costs. I guess that's all you got for doing that kind of thing back then. And then he eventually lost his job. So he continued then to live off the money his grandmother gave him, smoked, drink, though went to church with her, did chores around the house. And 3 years later, in January of 1985, he was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. This job required him to work nights, third shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. He worked 6 nights a week with only Saturday evenings off. He spent a lot of time in the library researching his favorite scientific subjects and was propositioned by a man there who slipped him a note offering to orally pleasure him. He did not respond to the man, but this brought back those repressed fantasies that he had been having, and he started checking out the local gay scene in Milwaukee, bathhouses, bars, bookstores. He stole a mannequin, a male model mannequin, from a clothing store and used it for pleasure until his grandmother found it, stowed in his closet, and demanded he throw it away, which caused him to begin to frequent the bathhouses to get actual real life partners, and rather enjoyed the interactions he had with the other men there, but he became very upset that they actually moved during sexual activity and began slipping them sleeping pills in their drinks to basically knock them out so that he could have his way with them. This sounds like a really stand-up guy. This is no way this video is getting monetized. Susan! He got the sleeping pills by going to doctors and informing them he worked nights and needed them to sleep during the day. And this was the 80s. Things were a little more loosey-goosey, so he had no problem getting the medication he needed for that. After about 12 times drugging people, the bathhouse finally got a little upset and revoked his membership. He then began meeting and trying to pick up young men in bars, libraries, gay bookstores, wherever he could, and took them back to hotels where he continued the practice. It was about this time he attempted one of his most weird acts, and that is trying to dig up the body of a recently deceased 18-year-old boy. But he could not do it because the ground was too hard. In 1986, he was arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior, for pleasuring himself in the presence of two 12-year-old boys at a nearby river. He initially claimed he was merely urinating, but yeah. It was lowered to disorderly conduct, and in 1987 he was sentenced to 1 year of probation and counseling. Now think about it. All the times this man has been arrested by the system and they just let him go. You would think that they would compare records and see, this guy's got problems and maybe we ought to put him in treatment instead of just continuing to slap him on the wrist and release him. Fast forward to November 1987 to his second murder. He met a young man by the name of Stephen Tumai at a bar and persuaded him to accompany him to the nearby Ambassador Hotel. He did, and during the night he had just planned, he said, to drug him and just fill on his body and do what he normally did. However, upon waking up the next day, he found Stephen dead, with a crushed chest, blood seeping from his mouth. He had bruises on his fists, so did Stephen, so evidently there had been a fight. And up until the point he was executed, Dahmer swore he does not remember what happened that night. So he decided he needed to dispose of the body. He purchased a large suitcase, transported the body from the hotel back to his grandmother's, where over the course of a week he severed the head, hands, feet. He then filleted the bones from the flesh, cut the flesh into small enough chunks that he could wrap up in newspaper and garbage bags, and then put the bones in a trash bag, took them out back, and powderized them with a sledgehammer and disposed of everything but the head in the trash. He kept the head wrapped in a blanket for about 2 weeks, and then he boiled it in a mixture of Soilex, which is a industrial detergent, and bleach in order to retain the skull. It removed all the flesh from it, and he kept the skull to pleasure himself with. But eventually the skull got too brittle, and he ended up having to powderize it and get rid of it as well. Over the next two to 4 months, Dahmer now began to actively seek out victims. He would lure them from gay bars or from street corners where he met them, usually back to his grandmother's house with the promise of $50 to either spend the night with him or pose for nude pictures. That's how he got 14-year-old James Doxeter, Richard Guerrero, who was in his 20s, and then another unnamed man back to his grandmother's house. Now, with the first two, he did drug them, and strangled them either by use of hands or with a leather strap. He did the same filleting and pulverizing method he had done to dispose of Stephen 𝐞𝐚𝐫𝐥𝐲's body and retain the skull. And then after the skull became too brittle, he would pulverize the skull. The third young man was very lucky in that Jeffrey's grandmother happened to wake up and ask if Jeffrey was there. Jeffrey answered him. The grandmother did see the young man, and because of that, Jeffrey did not kill him. He did drug him, did do what he wanted to do with him, and then drove him to County General Hospital, where the young man recovered. September of 1988, his grandmother asked him to move out of her house just because he was drinking, smoking. She did not like the fact he was bringing strange young men home, and his room smelled to high heaven, according to her. He quickly found a one-bedroom apartment and continued with his looking for young men and boys to seek pleasure from. He was arrested for drugging and fondling a 13-year-old boy he had lured to his home on the pretext of just posing for $50. Lionel, not wanting to give up on his son, hired an attorney by the name of Gerald Boyle to defend these charges, and Dahmer underwent several psychological evaluations and was diagnosed with a schizoid personality disorder and to be an impulsive individual. He pled guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. This was in January of 1989, and sentencing was suspended until May. 5 months later, that seems a bit excessive, but okay. In March, he moved back into his grandmother's house and lured a 24-year-old aspiring model by the name of Anthony Sears back to his grandmother's house. They met in a gay bar, and he offered him $50 to pose and brought him back to his grandmother's home. There, they did engage in oral sex. Dahmer drugged and then strangled Sears, his M.O. He attempted to fillet him, and he did decapitate the body and dispose of the majority of the body in his normal fashion, but he did retain his head and his genitalia in acetone. He stored them in a wooden box, took them to the chocolate factory, put them in his locker, and then eventually took those with him when he moved to a new apartment about a year later. Ugh. This is why I eat a lot of chocolate. This stuff right here. May 23rd, 1989, he was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year of house correction with work release permit and was placed on the register as a sex offender for the incident with the 13-year-old. Now, again, they had him. And all they had to do was keep him, and rest of the murders wouldn't have happened. But anyway, he did get out of house arrest 2 months earlier and decided to move into a new apartment at North 25th Street in Milwaukee, which would become 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, which would become quite famous. It was close to the chocolate factory, it was furnished, and it was $300 a month, including all utilities, so he could afford it. Shortly after moving into the apartment, he lured 32-year-old male prostitute Raymond Smith with an offer of $50 for his services, where he served him a laced drink and then strangled him. He purchased the famous Polaroid camera, and he took several pictures of Smith's body in suggestive positions and then dismembered him in the bathroom. He boiled his legs, arms, pelvis with Solex, and then allowed him to rinse the bones. He then dissolved the remainder of the skeleton in acid and spray painted Smith's skull and placed it alongside the skull of Sears, which, remember, Anthony Sears, he kept his private parts and his head. So here is another trophy for him, and he put it inside a metal filing cabinet there in the apartment. About a week later, May 27th, 1990, Dahmer lured another young man to his apartment, but he accidentally drank the drink meant for his victim and knocked himself out, and he woke up the next morning with several items of his clothing, $300 in cash, and a watch missing. He never reported this incident to the police, but he did tell his probation officer, "Hey, I was robbed." Lucky guy. June of 1990, he lured a 27-year-old by the name of Edward Smith to his apartment. He drugged and strangled him, his M.O., but instead of decapitating him in his normal fashion, and using acid to break things down and try to keep the skull, he decided to freeze the skull in the hopes that it would preserve some of its features. But instead, he ended up ruining it by trying to freeze and then bake it in the oven, and ended up having to destroy the body as he normally would. So he's really getting into some freaky deaky stuff. He also started Polaroiding most of his victims to retain some of their natural beauty and remind him of why he was attracted to them. So he began collecting the photographs as well as certain body parts, preserving them in different solutions with different methods, and storing them in the file cabinet and around his apartment in general. 3 months later, he encountered and brought home a Chicago man, 22 years old, by the name of Ernest Miller. Offered him again $50. He only gave him 2 sleeping pills, much different than his normal 7. And then he killed Miller by slashing his carotid artery with the same knife that he normally dissected his victims with, and he bled out. And then Dahmer posed with the entire nude body with the Polaroid, taking very demented selfies with a Polaroid. And he repeatedly kissed and talked to Smith's head while he took care of the rest of the body, preserving Smith's head. He wrapped his heart, biceps, and portions of his legs in plastic bags and placed them in the fridge for later consumption. This is where cannibalism started to enter in. He boiled the rest of him, made into Solex, and then disposed of it in his normal fashion. Over the next few months, he lured several young men. 3 weeks later, he encountered a 22-year-old David Thomas and lured him back to the apartment, had intercourse with him, strangled and dismembered, but kept no parts of his body. He completely just got rid of them. And then he didn't have anybody for 5 months. Not that he didn't try. He tried at all of his usual hangs, just could not get people to come home with him. He's probably developing quite a reputation by this point, and this is where he started harboring his own suicidal thoughts. In 1991, he began doing something different to his victims. Instead of strangling them, he began drugging them, boring a hole in their head, and putting hydrochloric acid in it, which instantly created sort of a lobotomy. And then he would drug them, kill them, dismembered them, and this happened to at least 2 to 3 victims that we know of in early 1991. If I listed all of Dahmer's victims, we'd be here all day, but I want to skip to one that was very, very unusual. 14-year-old Lao teenager, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this name, I apologize, 𝐞𝐚𝐫𝐥𝐲. He encountered Dahmer on Wisconsin Avenue. He was the younger brother of someone that Dahmer had molested but not killed back in 1998. He approached him, offered him some money. 𝐸𝐸 was initially reluctant, but began changing his mind when Dahmer offered him $50. He went back to the apartment with Dahmer and posed for 2 pictures in his underwear with the Polaroid before Dahmer drugged him and then performed oral sex on him. Did his new MO, drilled a single hole into his skull and injected the hydrochloric acid. But before he became so loopy that he passed out, he took him into the bedroom where he saw the remains of a 31-year-old by the name of Tony Hughes that Dahmer had murdered, about 3 or 4 days prior. He believed that the young boy did see the body, but did not react. It was probably the effects of everything that had just happened to him, and he became unconscious. Before killing him, Dahmer had a few beers and then decided to go drink at a bar and come back and deal with him later. So he left the young boy alone in his apartment. After midnight on May 27th, the following day, he returned to his apartment only to see the young boy out of his apartment, sitting on the corner of 25th and State Street, talking in Lao to 3 other Laotian women standing there with him. Dahmer approached them, said it was his boyfriend, and he needed to get him back into the apartment. The women were quite distressed and said, no, we've already called 911. He appears to be having some issues, so we're going to wait for the police. 2 Milwaukee police officers, John 𝐥𝐢𝐿 and Joseph Gabrish, arrived. Dahmer was very relaxed. He told them that 𝐸𝐸 was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that he needed to get him back into the apartment. And he had drunk too much, they had had a fight, and that it was just domestic and he needed to get him back into the apartment. The women, though, were very exasperated because one of them didn't speak really good English. And so they tried to indicate to the officers that there was something wrong with the young man and that they needed to treat this, they were trying to get this out to the police, but the police became quite hostile with them, telling them to butt out. This is domestic. They continued to protest. They called the fire department, who checked out 𝐸𝐸 and realized that he didn't have any real injuries. So it basically ended with 2 of the police officers walking Dahmer and his young victim back to Dahmer's apartment. He showed him the Polaroids proving they were lovers and this was just domestic. And basically, one of the officers, Officer 𝐥𝐢𝐿, said that he did smell something unusual in the apartment, but did nothing. And of course, Dahmer killed his victim soon after they left. And he retained his skull for future posterity. Around this time, other residents of the apartment building began complaining about the odor from Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer, over the course of 1978 to 1991, he would kill 17 young men and do various things with their body. He did travel to Chicago. He lured other young men back between until the end of 1991 when he was finally arrested. But he was still using his MO of drugs, strangulation, and injection of hydrochloric acid. It all came to an end July 22nd, 1991. Dahmer lured home 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, and immediately entering the apartment, Edwards noted that he smelled a very foul odor. There was a lot of hydrochloric acid, which Dahmer told him were for cleaning bricks. There was a videotape of The Exorcist 3, which is a terrible movie anyway. Insult to injury. Playing on the television, and also noted there was a 57-gallon drum in a corner, which smelled quite foul. Dahmer immediately saw the suspicion rising up in Edwards' face and brandished a knife, telling him he was just going to take nude pictures of him. Edwards unbuttoned his shirt in an effort to appease Dahmer and would allow him to do so if he would just stop all the craziness. Dahmer tried to handcuff him, and Edwards said, "Look, if you just unhandcuff me, I'll pose for whatever pictures you want me to, and there'll be no trouble." So basically, Dahmer tried to calm him down, asking him to kind of look at the TV. Let's watch some TV. Let's make this okay. And Edwards said that Dahmer was starting to rock back and forth, talking to himself, would put his head on his chest, listen to his heartbeat. Finally, he convinced Dahmer to remove the handcuffs. They sat there. They had a beer, they watched TV, and Edwards said that he told Dahmer he needed to go to the bathroom. So Dahmer kind of let his guard down. Edwards stood up to go to the bathroom. Edwards turned around, punched him, knocked him down, and ran out the front door. It was about 11:30 p.m. He flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers and noted that there was still a partial handcuff attached to his wrist. So he explained that a freak had lured him home and was trying to hold him hostage, and they agreed to accompany Edwards to the apartment. When they got back to the apartment, Dahmer invited them in. He did tell them that, it was sex that just went awry, and that he did handcuff him, but just for consensual purposes. They asked him where was the key so they could finish taking the handcuffs off of Edwards. And Dahmer said it was in the bedroom and he would get it. He tried to walk past the officers to go into the bedroom to get the key. One of the officers told him to back off. He went into there. He did see the key. He also saw a knife that was obviously well used, and in an open drawer saw the Polaroids of Dahmer posing with naked bodies. He picked the naked dead bodies. He picked them up, took them in, showed them to his partner, and said, "Hey, these are for real." "Yeah, you think so, BJ?" Because at this point, Dahmer went crazy, tried to fight with the officers. They subdued him. This is when they opened the refrigerator, found some of his accoutrements, and basically he was arrested. Upon excavating the apartment, they found all sorts of body parts. They found almost whole torsos. They found heads. You know what they found. Not going to show any pictures of it here, or Susan will have a heart attack. Over the course of 2 years, Dahmer would plead guilty to 16 counts of first-degree murder in Ohio and Wisconsin. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, as there was some dissension about his mental state, but he was generally considered to be sane at the time that he committed the murders, even though some jurors disagreed. I would say that, yes, there's a lot of mental illness here, and maybe we should have studied Dahmer rather than just throwing him in prison. That would have been he needed to be off the street, yes, but maybe we could have better understood the mentality that makes that type of serial killer if we had put him in a hospital and studied him instead of just throwing him in prison. But anyway, he was convicted, and life without the possibility of parole plus 10 years was the final outcome. He was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin to begin his sentence. He was kept in solitary confinement for the first 2 years due to their fears of him being placed in general population. He was finally placed in general population and, of course, found Jesus, as they all do, and was given a copy of the Bible, began to read. He became a born-again Christian, was baptized by a Church of Christ minister by the name of Roy Ratliff. Became a media darling, doing interviews with everybody from NBC to ABC. July 3rd, 1994, one inmate attempted to slash his throat with a razor blade embedded in a toothbrush. And then a few months later, in November of 1994, Dahmer was discovered beaten to death on the floor of the prison shower. Thus, how ends the life of a serial killer. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back soon with another video. And until next time, Keto and Krime, out.